Why would a country refuse to use its most powerful weapon, even while it is being attacked again and again? Canada has that weapon sitting right under its feet, and its prime minister keeps saying no. If this story surprises you even a little, smash that like button right now because it helps more people find this channel. Subscribe if you want to actually understand what is happening between two of the closest allies on Earth. And if you have a friend who thinks this is just another boring trade story, send them this video because it is anything but boring. Let's start with the moment that changed the tone of this entire fight. It is Monday, August the 24th, 2026. The President of the United States is sitting somewhere with his phone in his hand, and within minutes, steel prices, an auto plant in Ontario, and the mood in Ottawa are all about to shift at once. Donald Trump posts on social media that he will raise tariffs on Canadian cars, trucks, auto parts, and steel to 50%, starting January the 1st, 2027. Just 2 days earlier, trade talks between the two countries had completely collapsed. And in the middle of all this noise, one man, Canada's Prime Minister, Carney, has been saying something that nobody expected. He keeps telling anyone who will listen that Canada will not use oil as a weapon. Not now, not as leverage, not even when politicians inside his own country are practically begging him to. That single, quiet decision, held firmly for months, is the real story here. And once you understand why he is holding that line, you will understand why so many people are calling it the moment that changed the entire shape of this trade war. To understand why one sentence about oil carries this much weight, you need to look at how deep this relationship actually runs. The United States and Canada share the longest undefended border in the world, almost 9,000 kilometers of open land, with no walls and no checkpoints in most places. For decades, that border has meant something very specific in economic terms. Canada was the third largest source of goods coming into the United States in 2025, sending across more than $380 billion worth of products in a single year. Cars, steel, lumber, electricity, and oil, an enormous, unglamorous river of crude that flows south through pipelines every single day, feeding refineries all the way from the American Midwest down to the Gulf Coast. This is not a small trading relationship between two friendly neighbors. This is one of the most tightly connected economies on the entire planet, built up slowly over generations. And it is now being tested in a way that even experienced trade officials say they have never seen before. This tension did not appear out of nowhere this month. It has been building for well over a year. As early as 2025, Canadian officials were already quietly discussing what they called non-tariff retaliation, and energy was part of that conversation from the very beginning. Canada's energy minister at the time openly said that restricting oil exports or placing new duties on energy was something the government was actively considering. Everything is on the table, he said publicly. But even then, there was real hesitation behind the scenes. He admitted that Canada could not easily redirect the roughly 4 million barrels of oil it sends south every single day, because there simply was not enough alternative capacity anywhere else in the world to absorb it. The head of one of Canada's largest pipeline companies called the entire idea of restricting oil exports unwise. So the idea existed. It was debated in private rooms, but it never actually happened. Actually, it helps to understand just how tightly this oil relationship actually works, because these numbers are not abstract statistics sitting in a report somewhere. Canadian crude moves south mainly through pipelines feeding refineries across the Midwest and beyond. That volume, close to 4 million barrels every single day, was described by officials at the time as, in their words, pretty sticky. What that really means is that the pipelines, the refinery contracts, and the physical infrastructure on both sides of the border were built around that flow continuing, not around it being switched on and off like a bargaining chip whenever politics demanded it. Even Canada's existing spare capacity, some extra room on one pipeline, and a handful of rail alternatives would not come close to replacing 4 million barrels a day if that flow were suddenly cut. That is part of why, even when Canadian officials were openly discussing energy retaliation as an option back in 2025, the idea kept running straight into the same practical wall every single time. Now fast forward to the past few months, because the pressure on Canada has only gotten heavier. Prime Minister Carney, who took over Canadian leadership in the spring of 2025, has faced tariff threat after tariff threat coming out of Washington. Earlier this year, Trump warned Canada it would face 100% tariffs if Ottawa moved forward with a trade agreement involving China. That threat sat on top of a separate, longer-running dispute between Canada and China over unfair trade practices, a dispute that eventually led to a partial resolution earlier this year, where Canada agreed to lower tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for China easing pressure on Canadian agricultural exports. Canadian tariffs on Chinese steel, notably, stayed firmly in place even after that partial deal was signed. The bigger point here is simple. Carney has spent much of the past year being pulled from two completely different directions at once: pressure from Washington over trade and sovereignty, and pressure from Beijing over an entirely separate relationship, all while trying to hold together one coherent long-term strategy, instead of just reacting to every single new threat as it landed. By July, Trump had sent Canada a formal letter, one of more than 20 he sent to different trading partners that same month, announcing a 35% tariff on Canadian goods starting in August. That letter arrived just days before the two countries were supposed to reach a new trade agreement under a deadline both sides had agreed to earlier. Carney's response at the time was calm and measured. He said his government would keep protecting Canadian workers and Canadian businesses as that deadline approached. And through nearly all of it, through every single new threat, Carney kept returning to the exact same position on energy. Speaking to reporters at the end of July while visiting Alberta, Canada's oil heartland, Carney was asked directly whether Canada should use oil as a form of retaliation. His answer was blunt and immediate. "I don't see the value of it," he said. He argued that Canada's global reputation as a dependable energy supplier was worth far more than any short-term leverage it might gain by choking off the taps for a few tense weeks. "Being a reliable supplier is important," Carney told the reporters standing in front of him. "People trust us. And so when you're a supplier of a key commodity, a key service, you've got to think really hard about not supplying it." That is the heart of what people are now calling Carney's oil warning. Not a threat to cut off American energy, the exact opposite. A warning aimed as much at his own political allies as it was aimed at Washington, that turning oil into a weapon would do lasting damage to Canada's credibility long after this particular fight with Trump has quietly faded into history. It is a genuinely unusual position for a leader to hold under this much economic pressure, and it has absolutely not gone unchallenged inside his own country. Now let's get into exactly what happened this past week, because the relationship did not just quietly get worse. It broke publicly in front of the entire world. Trade negotiators from both countries had been working through the summer, and by the middle of August, there was cautious optimism that a deal could actually be reached before things got worse. That optimism completely collapsed on Friday, August the 21st. Carney suspended the talks late that Friday and called his negotiating team straight back to Ottawa. The reason he gave was simple and direct. The deal on the table was unacceptable. "We cannot accept what they've offered, and we will not give what they've asked," he told reporters waiting outside. Then came the response from Washington. Early the next mornings on Saturday, the United States activated 50% tariffs on close to $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. This was not a small, symbolic gesture aimed at making a political point. The list included hockey sticks, beer, cheese, cement, plywood, and milk, everyday products that touch ordinary families on both sides of the border every single week. Standing on Parliament Hill in Ottawa, Carney did not soften his language at all. "We got attacked," he told the reporters gathered around him. He confirmed that Canada would respond with matching dollar-for-dollar retaliatory tariffs, set to take effect on September the 8th. And this is exactly where the oil question came right back up. Reporters asked Carney directly whether energy and critical minerals would be part of Canada's response. Once again, he seemed reluctant to put energy on the table at all. "We have a range of other options to protect our industry," he said, pointing instead toward faster development of Canada's critical mineral sector, framed clearly as reducing long-term dependence on the American market, rather than using existing energy flows as an immediate bargaining chip in the middle of a crisis. It was, once again, a deliberate and public choice not to escalate on oil, even while escalating almost everywhere else at the exact same time. Not everyone inside Canada agreed with that restraint, and that disagreement quickly became its own separate story. Ontario's Premier, Doug Ford, one of the loudest voices in this entire saga, posted publicly that Saturday night that Carney had his full support for a strong response. But Ford's own position went noticeably further than the Prime Minister's. In a letter sent to Carney that same week, Ford argued that electricity, energy, and critical minerals infrastructure should all be part of Canada's negotiating leverage right now. "We cannot back down in the face of economic coercion," Ford wrote. He even proposed targeting Canada's retaliatory tariffs, specifically at products coming from states he described as politically important to the current American administration's base of support. It is worth sitting with Ford's proposal for a moment, because the thinking behind it tells you something important about how deliberate this fight has become on the Canadian side. He was not simply talking about maximizing economic pain in the abstract, spread evenly across the entire United States. He was talking about maximizing political pain in very specific places, states that matter enormously to the current administration's political base. Whether that particular idea ever gets folded into Canada's actual retaliation package is still unclear, But it shows just how far some Canadian officials are willing to go, at least in their public rhetoric, compared with Carney's own noticeably more careful and restrained tone. This set up a genuine and visible split inside Canada's own political class, one that only grew more obvious as the days passed. One opposition leader reluctantly agreed that taxes or restrictions on energy exports should at least remain available as a deterrent, if nothing else. Doug Ford pushed the argument even harder on a Toronto radio program, saying, "We have to make sure that they feel pain like we're going to feel pain." But Alberta's premier, Danielle Smith, representing the province that actually produces the overwhelming majority of Canada's oil, held the exact opposite line throughout. She consistently said she would not allow energy exports to be used as leverage in this fight, a position that put her much closer to Carney's own stance than to Ford's. Two provinces, two very different views on what Canada's biggest resource should actually be used for, and a prime minister caught trying to hold the country together in the middle. So by the time Monday, August the 24th arrived and Trump escalated again with his 50% tariff threat on autos, trucks, parts, and steel, Canada was already quietly managing this internal fault line over energy, while trying at the same time to present a united front to Washington. Trump's Monday post was aimed squarely at Carney personally. "Canada has been ripping off the United States of America for years," Trump wrote. On trade, and in other ways also, they are among the worst nations in the world to deal with. He pointed to what he described as a $60 billion trade deficit between the two countries as the justification for these new tariffs. Later that same day, Trump escalated the rhetoric even further, writing that Canada will be treated like a state no longer, and adding that someone should get these clowns to fall in line, or the consequences for Canada will be far worse. Let's pause here for a second, because this story is genuinely still unfolding in real time, and what comes next explains exactly why so many economists are worried. If this video is teaching you something you did not fully understand before, tap that subscribe button now, because the next section explains the real economic stakes hiding underneath all of this political noise. The economic numbers behind all of this rhetoric are significant, and they are worth explaining clearly. Two Japanese automakers alone represented more than 3/4 of Canada's total vehicle production last year, and each of those two companies individually produced more vehicles inside Canada than 3 major American automakers combined. That detail matters, because it shows just how deeply Canada's auto industry has become tied to manufacturers that are not even American. Manufacturers who now face a 50% tariff wall heading straight into the American market starting next year, if nothing changes between now and then. One economist described the core problem facing Canada in blunt terms. Diversifying away from the world's largest consumer economy, sitting right on your doorstep, is, in his words, impossible to do in any truly meaningful way, at least not quickly. Economists have estimated that if this new 50% tariff rate gets extended across a larger share of Canadian exports to the United States, it could knock around 2% off Canada's entire economy and push the country toward a genuine recession. That same reporting noted that this tariff package would likely have relatively little direct impact on the American economy itself, simply because the American economy is so much larger and so much more diversified, which is part of why analysts keep describing this as an unbalanced fight. One where Canada carries far more risk than the United States does, even though the tariffs on paper look completely reciprocal. This is exactly the backdrop against which Carney's decision to hold the line on oil takes on real serious weight. Well, it would have been politically easy, in the middle of a public war of words with an American president calling your country's officials clowns, to reach for the single most powerful lever available. Oil is that lever. Roughly 4 million barrels a day is not a small number. It is the kind of volume that, if disrupted even briefly, would send real shockwaves through American refining markets, especially across the Midwest, where much of that Canadian crude actually gets processed. And yet, according to every major report on this story, Carney has chosen again and again not to pull that lever. There is a deeper strategic argument underneath Carney's public reasoning, and it goes far beyond a simple appeal to reputation. Following the collapse of trade talks, Carney laid out a broader philosophy about how Canada should think about its own natural resources going forward. He argued that Canada's energy and mineral wealth should not primarily be seen as a short-term weapon to use against one single trading partner, no matter how tempting that might feel in the moment. Instead, it should be treated as a long-term source of genuine independence. The more Canada builds out its ability to sell natural gas to Asia, expand its role as an oil supplier beyond North America, grow uranium and critical minerals production, and increase electricity exports to entirely new markets, the less vulnerable it becomes to the decisions of any single country, including the United States. Carney summarized this entire philosophy in a phrase that has been repeated many times since. Mastering our energy is mastering our destiny. It is a longer horizon argument than the immediate demand for direct retaliation coming from Ontario's premier, and explains exactly why Carney has been willing to absorb real criticism from inside his own coalition for holding back on oil right now, even while everything else around him keeps escalating. There is also a broader diplomatic layer to this story that helps explain why Carney is choosing restraint here, even as he escalates everywhere else. Earlier this year, speaking at a major global economic forum, Carney talked publicly about what he sees as a worldwide shift toward what he called economic integration used as a weapon, describing a pattern where powerful nations increasingly treat tariffs as leverage and supply chains as vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. His argument at that forum was that middle powers, countries like Canada, need to resist being pulled into that exact same pattern, because doing so slowly undermines the entire rules-based system that smaller and mid-sized economies depend on for their own long-term stability. If we're not at the table, we're on the menu, he said, a line that traveled well beyond Canada's own borders at the time. Seen through that lens, Carney's refusal to weaponize oil is not simply about staying popular with American buyers. It is about which kind of global economic order Canada actually wants to be seen defending, even while it is being actively squeezed by its own largest trading partner. None of this means the relationship between Ottawa and Washington has calmed down. Far from it. The tone from the American side has hardened noticeably in just the past week alone. Trump's language moved quickly from talking about deficits and trade imbalances toward personal insults directed at Canadian officials, and from tariff threats on specific goods toward broader statements questioning Canada's standing altogether, including that now widely repeated remark that Canada would be treated like a state no longer. Meanwhile, on the Canadian side, the currency has felt this pressure directly, sliding as the two countries edge closer to what one currency strategist called an all-out trade war, with economists warning that Canada's smaller, more trade-dependent economy is far more exposed to a prolonged standoff like this than the larger, more diversified American economy sitting right across the border. There is a longer arc to Carney's overall economic strategy worth laying out here too, because the oil restraint does not exist all by itself in isolation. Back in November of last year, Carney told reporters in Toronto that Canada's trading relationship with the United States, treated for decades as one of the country's core strengths, had quietly become, in his own words, now a weakness. At the time, he set a public goal for Canada to double its non-American exports over the next decade, arguing that American tariffs were creating a genuine chill on investment across the entire Canadian economy. The jobs of workers in our most affected industries, autos, steel, lumber, are under threat, Carney said. Our businesses are holding back investments, restrained by the uncertainty hanging over all of us right now. That same underlying logic runs through everything else Carney has said since, including his comments about critical minerals development slowly decoupling from the American market, and his broader argument that Canada's long-term security lies in diversifying who it sells to, rather than turning what it already sells to America into a short-term political weapon. It is worth pausing here for a genuine moment of honesty about what is actually confirmed and what remains uncertain, because that distinction matters enormously in a story moving this fast. It is confirmed that Carney has repeatedly and publicly rejected using oil exports as retaliation, both in July and again just this past weekend. It is confirmed that Trump escalated tariff threats on Monday, targeting Canadian autos, trucks, parts, and steel at 50% starting January of next year. It is confirmed that trade talks collapsed on Friday, and that 50% tariffs on roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods went into effect the very next day. It is confirmed that Canada has announced dollar-for-dollar retaliatory tariffs beginning September the 8th. What remains genuinely unresolved is exactly what form that retaliation will ultimately take, whether energy will factor into it in some indirect way further down the road, and whether the internal political pressure from figures like Doug Ford will eventually shift Carney's position entirely. Before we go further, here's something a little different. Comment one single word below telling me where in the world you are watching this from right now, because I genuinely want to see how far this particular story is actually traveling across different countries. And while you are already typing that comment, go ahead and hit subscribe. 2, because we are about to look closely at exactly why this fight matters far beyond just Canada and the United States. It is worth stepping back here and asking why this particular dispute has drawn so much attention well beyond just these two countries. Trade analysts watching from Europe and from Asia have described this entire standoff as something close to a test case, a signal of how the current American administration intends to treat even its closest, most deeply integrated allies, whenever trade imbalances become politically useful talking points at home. Canada is not a rival economic power. It is not a country the United States has historically treated as any kind of strategic competitor. It is a neighbor, a longtime ally, and until very recently, one of the most stable and predictable trading partners Washington has ever had in its entire history. That is exactly why Carney's remarks about middle powers needing to stand together in the face of economic coercion resonated so widely when he first made them, and why his continued restraint on oil, even under direct pressure from inside his own country, has been read by many observers as an attempt to actually demonstrate that kind of principled, rules-based conduct in practice, not merely in speeches given at global forums. None of this guarantees that Carney's approach will hold forever. Political pressure inside Canada is real, and it is growing, steadily rather than shrinking. If this trade war deepens further into the autumn, if the new auto tariffs actually take effect in January as currently scheduled, or if American rhetoric continues moving in the same direction it took this past Monday, it is entirely possible that the calculus inside Ottawa shifts, and that voices like Doug Ford's or figures inside Carney's own cabinet who have previously floated energy restrictions as an option gain real momentum in these internal debates. For now, though, based on everything reported so far, that shift has simply not happened. The oil keeps flowing south exactly as it always has. The warning still stands. So where does this actually leave things heading into September? The retaliatory tariffs Canada announced are set to take effect on September the 8th, matched dollar for dollar against the American measures that hit Canadian goods in late August. The new American tariffs on Canadian autos, trucks, parts, and steel are scheduled for January the 1st of next year, assuming absolutely nothing changes between now and then. And given how quickly this entire relationship has shifted over just the past 10 days alone, a great deal could still genuinely change before that date ever arrives. Trade officials on both sides have not ruled out a return to the negotiating table. Carney himself has said Canada would come back to talks if the United States approaches with, in his words, the right attitude toward Canadian industries and a true partnership. Whether that actually happens before January remains an honestly open question that nobody, not the analysts, not the officials, and not this video, can answer with real certainty right now. What can be said with confidence is this. In a trade war defined almost entirely by escalation, tariffs answering tariffs, insults answering insults, one major lever has so far been deliberately left completely untouched. Canada has not restricted oil flowing to the United States. Not in July, when Carney first ruled it out publicly in Alberta. Not in August, after trade talks collapsed and 50% tariffs hit Canadian goods overnight. Not even after Trump's Monday escalation, calling Canadian officials clowns and threatening to double tariffs on the country's entire auto sector. That restraint now has a name, at least in how this story has been framed publicly. People are calling it Carney's oil warning, not because he ever threatened to cut anything off, but because he has repeatedly, publicly, and specifically warned against the temptation to do exactly that, even while pressure from inside his own political coalition keeps pushing hard in the opposite direction. So here's a genuine question worth sitting with for a moment. Should a country hold back its single most powerful economic lever for the sake of long-term credibility, even while it is actively being squeezed by tariffs, insults, and escalating threats from its largest trading partner? Or does that kind of restraint eventually start to look like weakness the other side simply learns to take for granted? There is no obvious right answer here, and reasonable people watching this unfold in Ottawa and Washington and in Calgary clearly disagree with each other on this exact point. What is certain is that this story is still being written in real time, sometimes hour by hour, and the honest truth is that nobody fully knows yet how it ends. One man is holding a line that his own allies want him to abandon, betting that patience and reliability will matter more in the long run than a single dramatic move right now. Whether history proves him right or proves him foolish may end up shaping how Canada is trusted and how it trades with the entire world. For decades after this particular fight with Washington has finally faded from the headlines. If this breakdown actually helped you understand what is really happening between these two countries, instead of just watching another dramatic headline scroll past your screen, that is exactly why this channel exists in the first place. Hit like if you want more videos that turn complicated world events into something you can actually follow from, start to finish. Subscribe if you want to catch the next update the moment new developments break, because September the 8th is coming fast, and January is coming right behind it. And if someone in your life still thinks this is just noise between two friendly neighbors, send them this video, because the neighbors are not so friendly right now, and the whole world is quietly taking notes.